Urban Cultural Studies,
the podcast.
interviews.
And welcome to Urban Cultural Studies Podcast. Today our guest is Araceli Masterson-Algar, who is Assistant Professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies at Augustana College and Associate Editor of the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies. Her interests focus on migration dynamics between Latin America, the U.S., and Spain, and much of her work explores the ties between Ecuador to Spain migration, cultural production, and urban planning in both Quito and Madrid. Welcome to the program, Araceli. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
I've just read your article. It's titled Juggling Aesthetics and Surveillance in Paradise. Ecuadorians in Madrid's Retiro Park. What I love about your work is how you're able to blend cultural criticism, urban studies, anthropology, even ethnography. And this article is no exception. You're focusing in particular on Madrid's Retiro Park, which boasts a storied past, located as it is in the central part of the city. You say in your abstract that you're really interested in the period running from the turn of the century through 2003, but I think your analysis extends to much more contemporary times. Also, you incorporate theories by Barcelona-based urban anthropologist Manuel Delgado. His more recent works, in fact, you analyze a short film from 2012 titled Imagine Madrid. You look at contemporary immigration and tourism dynamics, the city's changing built environment, many things put together. I know this is an area you've worked in for quite some time now. Tell us first about the large number of Ecuadorians in Madrid.
Well, Ecuador's recent history in Madrid expands over a decade, and it's changed a lot over time. A grosso modo, Ecuadorian migration to Spain became quite notorious in the late 1990s, particularly due to economic and political uncertainty in Ecuador, but also in response to Spain's increasing labor demands, and particularly for caregivers, domestic work, and construction. It was really during these years, roughly between 1999 and 2004, that Spain became the second most popular destination for migrants in the world, and actually the first destination in Europe.
So that ranking reflects total immigration and not just Ecuadorian immigrants, right?
Right. To give you an idea, in 1980, there were an estimated 182,000 foreign documented residents. By 2006, that number had increased to over 5 million.
Wow.
Of those, over 1.5 million arrived from Latin America, and most of them arrived from Ecuador.
Wow.
Yeah, the events of September 11th factored into this. This further closed the idea of the U.S. as a possible destination. There were also, of course, feelings of having a shared culture and language, etc., with Spain that also contributed to Ecuadorians' decision to migrate to Spain. Between 1999 and 2003, this is roughly the period that I address in the article, Ecuadorian women were the undeniable pioneers and protagonists of the migratory experience.
I see.
They met for the increasing demands for domestic workers and caregivers. And this, of course, was a clear response to cuts to the welfare state and to the large numbers of Spanish women that were then entering professional careers. Spaniards were looking for Ecuadorian women as domestic workers and caregivers because, of course, they spoke the same language, and in general, they're thought of as being culturally closer to Spaniards, say, than Eastern Europeans or North African women, for instance.
So one can see why Spaniards were so keen on having a workforce of Ecuadorian women. How many Ecuadorian immigrants were moving to Spain and choosing Madrid over other destinations?
Most. Historically, Madrid has been Ecuadorians' primary destination. Ecuadorians were the largest migrant population in the capital from 2000 through 2006. Of course, following the economic downturn of 2008, many have returned to Ecuador or have migrated elsewhere in Europe, more so than any other foreign national group. But yet, today, of the approximately 300,000 Ecuadorians in Spain, over 31% are residents of Madrid. These estimations could actually be much higher if we consider that the census does not always account for undocumented residents, nor does it include Ecuadorians who have acquired Spanish citizenship. And this is, of course, not to mention a whole second generation of Ecuadorians. In fact, in 2009, Madrid led the country in the number of concessions of Spanish nationality, over half of which were granted to its Ecuadorian residents.
Ah.
And so, yes, so without a doubt, Ecuadorians have over a decade of continued presence in Madrid, and they have shaped the city in many, many ways.
And in your research, you've seen how Ecuadorians have shaped and experienced the city firsthand, right? That is, you've interviewed Ecuadorians living and working in Madrid on a number of occasions. Would you call what you're doing a participant observation approach? Tell us a little bit about where you've spoken with them, what you've done together, what have they told you, what have you learned?
Yes, I've been working with Ecuadorians in Madrid since 2002. I began as a collaborator with the Asociación Rumiñahui Hispano-Ecuatoriana. It's the most influential Ecuadorian association in Spain. Historically, it has been. Its former president, Dora Aguirre, is actually the current representative for Europe, Asia, and Australia in the National Assembly of Ecuador. My research was just a natural follow-up, really, to questions and observations from my work in social ties at the grassroots level. I came to know Madrid through the time I shared with Ecuadorian colleagues. It didn't take me too long to realize that the Madrid I was experiencing was really from the Ecuadorian reality, and that it was invisible to the city's long-term residents. I guess the easiest way to put it is that there were continuous disjunctures between the city I was living and its representations.
So what do you mean by that? Continuous disjunctures?
Well, for instance, I would go out with Ecuadorian friends, have a pleasant evening, and then later would find out that the area where I had been was famous for its violence, and that it was tied to an imaginary far removed from the experience I had just lived. On many occasions, I'd get very frustrated asking for directions to a location, and then later I would realize that this location didn't exist outside of the Ecuadorian context, or that for Madrid's long-term residents, this location had just simply a different name and significance. The popular park of the Casa de Campo is a case in point. Ecuadorians that are heading to the Casa de Campo will tell you that their destination is a place called Lago. So time after time, I witnessed how one same location became different spaces depending on lived experiences, on perceptions and ideas. Of course, the work of critical geographers and of Lefebvre in particular did provide me with the theoretical framework I needed to address Madrid, the Madrid that I knew best and which was inseparable from the Ecuadorian experience.
Yeah, a great example here of how the city is imagined, it is perceived. In a way, it is produced differently by different groups of people for different purposes.
Exactly. And because spaces are lived and imagined, I just knew from the start that I would need a mixed transnational and transdisciplinary methodology. It had to include ethnographic work, and it had to include cultural analysis. I like to think of this method as one response to Manuel Delgado's call for, he calls it an antropología de las calles, an anthropology of the streets.
Right.
And he finds it indispensable to approach what, in his words, and I'd like to quote him on this, he says, a method indispensable to approach the urban melted universe.
Yeah.
I love that. In the context of migration, this procedural nature that Delgado identifies for urban space is really intense. Everyday experiences are particularly contingent on changes in policy, the economy, public perception. And this is to an extent that really by the time I completed my research, I felt I could have started all over again. So yes, there's a large ethnographic component because my purpose is to show how the vitality of a space is the outcome of lived experiences that take place on its grounds.
So you were interviewing Ecuadorian immigrants in the public spaces of the city?
Yes, most of the interviews took place in parks. There was a sort of patchwork involved with the process, since by the time I began my research in El Retiro, Ecuadorian gatherings were part of its erased history. Most of my interviews with Ecuadorians about El Retiro took place actually in other parks. Luckily, when I was doing grassroots work, I was I went oftentimes to El Retiro with friends between 2000 and 2003. And so it was easy for me to engage with the memories of El Retiro that came up in the interviews. However, I spent many hours during the process of writing and gathering the materials for this article, I spent many hours walking through the areas of El Retiro where the Ecuadorian gatherings used to take place. And by this time of my research, this area was just silent, heavily gardened.
Now there, do you mean heavily gardened or heavily guarded? Or perhaps both?
Both, actually. Both. After the inauguration of the monument, the municipality hired a private security company to watch the area. Then later, after 2010, I haven't seen the private company, but a pretty heavy presence of the regular police. But this area is also heavily gardened.
Mm-hmm.
It is virtually impossible to get a large group of people. There is no room for social gatherings now. But to answer your question, during my actual research, which took place intermittently between 2004 and 2009, I conducted regular observations, surveys, and interviews in other parks. Above all, it was in the Casa de Campo where I conducted most of the interviews.
Can you point out for listeners where the Casa de Campo is situated in relation to the Retiro Park?
Okay. Yeah, the Retiro is in the city center, but La Casa de Campo is on the west side of the city. This is Madrid's largest park. This park became the new location for Ecuadorian weekend gatherings after the situation in El Retiro made it impossible. I spend almost every Sunday for 6 months at these gatherings in the Casa de Campo, and that's where I recorded many nostalgic accounts about El Retiro. And I listened to a lot of reasons that people gave to explain why they could no longer meet at El Retiro. To my surprise, while many would blame the police presence, which is what I had really initially anticipated, or other forms of surveillance, most of the people in the Casa de Campo kept referring to the former location at El Retiro, that section that I study of La Chopera. They address it as a sacred place, as a burying ground, as a Campo Santo, and a place that they couldn't gather, where they couldn't gather anymore because it demanded respect. These explanations sounded so absurd that the first time that I heard them, I ignored them. But when I heard them again, repeated, I knew that I had to return to that specific area of El Retiro, and that's when I found out that it had become the site for the construction of the 11M memorial, the memorial for the train bombings of March 11th of 2004. So in other words, the Retiro was not even a location I planned to analyze at first. I knew for a fact that the Ecuadorians didn't gather there anymore, so I had just really scratched it off my list. But the ethnographic work that I did in the Casa de Campo is what took me back to El Retiro and then to further question its significance in Madrid's Ecuadorians' history.
And you're talking not just about Ecuadorians, but you're interested in a specific part of the park. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's southwest corner. It's an area that's known as La Chopera. It had been in disuse since the 1980s, and it had been off El Retiro's beaten paths, and this is largely why it became a seminal space for thousands of Ecuadorians arriving to Madrid between 2000 and 2003. And now this same place is the location for the Forest of Memory, which is the first memorial to the victims of the train bombings that took place in Madrid on March 11th of 2004.
This is huge. So you're asking this question: how is it that this specific area of the park was precisely that very space which was used for this urban memorial, the building of which, the construction of which, effectively displaced a huge number of Ecuadorians,
yes,
preventing them from congregating in public the way they had been?
Exactly. And truly the abrupt end to the gatherings of El Retiro had serious material consequences for Ecuadorians. But of course we rarely hear, right, explanations of why Ecuadorians made so much use of this public space. It is still the case, but it was more so during the first years between 1998 and 2003. During those years, many Ecuadorians had to live in crowded housing conditions. They didn't have the legal means or the money to live with their families. And Madrid's parks became the key grounds of socialization for migrants.
Right.
And then remember that the majority of Ecuadorians in Madrid were women employed as living domestic workers. And they lived in their actual workplace. And so even if they had family in Madrid, they were living in separate households. The weekend gatherings in El Retiro were the actual private and family space for these families, for these women. And besides, it was in those same years that the area close to El Retiro, Madrid Centro district, the upper class district of Retiro, that area housed the city's highest concentration of Ecuadorian residents. And that, added to the fact that the park was easily accessible on foot or by public transportation, further explains the preference of this park over other parks. But then again, Ecuadorians didn't gather in the visible and advertised areas of El Retiro. They chose that bare piece of land of La Chopera. So this previously isolated place of La Chopera became the central location of Ecuadorian socialization and really a site for a migratory economy. If you visited these gatherings, you would see people consuming and selling Ecuadorian dishes and drinks, purchasing CDs and DVDs with Ecuadorian latest music and shows. You could even get a cheap haircut. In these spaces, there were stands where you could record, send messages to families back home. These gatherings also offered the opportunity to survive because it was there that one could network for jobs, find and advertise businesses and services, learn how and where to access doctors, complete paperwork, and so on. In La Chopera, Ecuadorians were able to ground themselves really as Madrid's residents. And of course, as the gatherings became larger and larger, the problem is that they began drawing more attention. It didn't take long before people on the columns in the local papers began complaining about migrants' excessive and inappropriate uses of the park. And the backdrop for these processes was that persistent imaginary that El Retiro is Madrid's paradise, right? That it's supposed to be a vital and a moral landscape for the perpetuity of Madrid's citizenry, and this image contributes to hiding the park's ties to Madrid's local and global economy and its history of exclusion, which has historically relied on definitions over its proper usage and, of course, its proper users.
This is an important phrase that you said. A moral landscape for Madrid's citizenry.
Absolutely.
It makes me want to ask, how was what was happening in this part of the Retiro Park an expression of a more pervasive desire of late, perhaps, to reimagine Madrid's public spaces?
Sure.
That is, there were a number of plans and initiatives that came down from above, so to speak, plans that concerned the park itself, plans for the larger city, that were focused on attracting and sustaining a certain kind or even a certain brand of tourism, plans bent on reconfiguring the Spanish capital as, and this is a phrase that belongs in quotes, as a global city.
Absolutely, absolutely. El Retiro has been a powerful symbol of Madrid's middle-class imaginary since the 19th century, and its history is key to understand its present dynamics. But my specific focus is on El Retiro's significance as a symbol of Madrid since the 1990s, when the capital set the priority of gaining global recognition as a modern metropolis. And this priority became really to attract foreign capital and to extend investments abroad, and of course to increase the protagonism of the city in the pages of tourist guides worldwide. Here, the location of El Retiro is key, because it is part of that golden triangle, the set right between the Prado, the Thyssen Museum, and the Reina Sofia museums. So it extends east of the Paseo del Prado, part of Madrid's north-south axis, that includes the emblematic Paseo de la Castellana.
Yeah, buses of tourists are dropped off and picked back up in that area every day.
Precisely. So it is a crucial location of Madrid's tourist package. And its promotion as Madrid's stage is evident in a never-ending list of manufactured festivals. I mean, you have the water and fireworks in San Isidro, the annual book fair, the fashion event Pasarela Cibeles. In February of 2002, there was a week-long celebration of Spain's naval force. 6 months later, El Retiro becomes part of the Pope's visit for World Youth Day. Naval forces and the church. I mean, what better metaphors to show the symbolic power of El Retiro as fortress and sanctuary of Madrid's public image?
Definitely.
Christina Boyer explains that sites of spectacle can erase the distinctions between the orchestrated spectacle and the dystopic cityscape outside of it. In El Retiro, these spectacular events display local and national pride. And then, on the contrary, right, the presence of large crowds of marked migrants in its southwest corner spoke to the economic disparities and social fragmentation. The transformations of La Chopera into the memorial forest to the victims of March 11, to me, reveals unquestionable ties between the park and processes of capital accumulation that extend very much beyond it. Above all, we have the drive of the city to attract tourism and migration dynamics inseparable from Madrid's immersion in the global arena. I mean, after all, how did La Chopera become that was isolated and mostly unknown? How did it become the location of choice for the 11M memorial? There are many answers to this question.
Well, let's get into those answers.
So, first of all, La Chopera is close to Atocha Station, and this was one of the sites of the bombings. From an official standpoint, it was also an empty space because it didn't have any officially assigned function. And La Chopera was also part of the municipality's plan since the 1990s. Specifically, it is included in the Plan Especial para el Eje Prado Recoletos, the special plan for the Prado Recoletos axis, which aims to transform the Paseo del Prado and its elongation through the Paseo de Recoletos into an ambitious tourist boulevard. Well, one cannot help thinking that the construction of the memorial also could have been quite convenient in light of the increasing visibility and public outcry over Ecuadorians' presence in the park. So while not necessarily the reason, I believe it factored into the decision. I should note that the municipality has invested 15.7 million euros in plans to improve the park, and that it announced an additional 4.4 million for its cleaning and conservation, and this included the recuperation of La Chopera. We have again these repeated references to the need to recuperate the space. Mm-hmm. This is not only the wording of the actual document. The former mayor, Alberto Ruiz Gallardón, said in multiple occasions that the plan's objectives were to recuperate this, or the original designs of El Retiro, and also to protect, another term that he used, the historical memory and the functionality of its spaces. In other words, this plan aims to assure that the park spaces are used and remembered for what it is deemed they should be. And the premise here, of course, is that the municipality's guidelines will make the park more socially equal. Although not directly to the migrant reality, the recent measures in El Retiro work to the same contradictory framework.
Yeah, right.
Think, for instance, of all the recent actions aimed to protect El Retiro's so-called public spaces. I mean, you have the prohibition of the drumming circles since 2009. You have report after report of police mistreatment, many of these reports coming from the elderly. The long list of fines for walking dogs off the leash, for feeding pigeons and cats, for climbing trees or sculptures. Then, in February 2012, you might remember how El Retiro's family kiosks were put to the best bidder. This affected the lives of over 100 families, and because they weren't able to compete with large investors.
Right.
Thousands of supportive residents expressed their support to the kiosk owners. You had large gatherings for this purpose in El Retiro. Just the same as some years ago, people were speaking against the prohibition on the drumming circles. Although countering the municipality's decision, these protests resort to the same discourse of El Retiro's public space. And they reiterate, right, this image of the park as a moral and vital paradise.
We could get much more, I think, into this notion of public space itself, what exactly that phrase really means.
Yeah.
Manuel Delgado, who you mentioned, has a lot to say about this indeed, and I'm hoping we can come back to that later. But first, let's go back to that film I mentioned at the beginning of the interview. It's titled Imagine Madrid 2012. In your article, you're citing some of the official language that was used by, I think it was the Convention Bureau of Madrid, who wanted the film's viewers to discover, this is a quote, discover why Madrid is the best choice for business.
Precisely.
Tell us what the viewer of that short film, Imagine Madrid, sees. Describe and unpack that visual experience for us.
Sure. This short film was produced in both English and Spanish. As viewers, it leads us to imagine ourselves experiencing a city that received 8.3 million tourists in 2011 alone, and where over 2,000 multinationals have established their headquarters. The film wants to show that Madrid is committed to making business easy, and it uses this word easy. It assures investors that if they pick Madrid, they're guaranteed absolute freedom of movement with superb infrastructure, technology, and services. And interestingly, and here's where El Retiro ties in, Madrid appears above all as an epitome of an environmentally sound environment. The voice in off tells us that the city has 227,000 above that number trees, and that it has 18 square meters of green space per inhabitant. This Madrid of 2012 appears as a natural paradise, and here trees, heritage, and business intersect. El Retiro makes its appearance through the inclusion of its lake areas, the Crystal Palace, for example, with a series of shots that tie El Retiro to healthy living, family togetherness, and of course, beautiful landscapes and architecture.
I should say, too, that if listeners want a great look at the Retiro Park, watch, it's a film by Carlos Saura from 1996 or 97, around there, called just Taxi, and it features some incredible nighttime shots of the park's beauty, the Crystal Palace specifically, lit up at night.
Yes, but of course imagine Madrid 2012 is all about the day, the daylight, the sun, and bright futures. The crisp lighting throughout the film and the visual and the verbal references to sunlight in Imagine Madrid 2012 offer us a city that, and this is one of the sentences included in the film, that lights up the future, right? And which the voice in off reminds us that is fully part of Europe. In the article, I use the film as an example of the abundance of promotional packets that present Madrid as an image to be consumed rather than a place to be inhabited. We just saw the significance of El Retiro quite clearly in the city's promotional materials for its candidacy to the 2020 Olympics. In those advertisements, Madrid's slogan was that the city was ready to shine.
And we just learned of their loss to Tokyo for those Olympics a few weeks ago. But we're left with this question, or rather this opposition between Madrid as a business town, a friendly destination for international capital and for tourist dollars, and then also, on the other hand, the Madrid that is in truth sustained by the workforce of an increasing number of immigrants.
That's right.
Immigrants whose access to the city, whose right to the city, to put it that way, is constantly subjected to scrutiny.
Eco. I mean, just look at how the municipality celebrates mobility, right? How it highlights the city's openness and its accessibility. When really, on the other hand, we have the thousands of migrant residents facing increasing surveillance, detentions, deportations, in a continuous trend to make their visibility peripheral. The former mayor, Ruiz Gallardón, in the inaugural speech for the memorial at La Chopera, described this initiative as an attempt to make everyone feel identified and welcome to the space. And I find this extremely ironic because the construction of this bosque, of this monument, included more than sufficient regulations to dispel Madrid's migrant residents from its grounds. What is at play, and what I was hoping to show, what I hope to show through the article, is what Delgado terms ciudadanismo, an ideology working to harmonize public space with capitalism. And this allows to sustain a model of exploitation that does not contest capitalism, right? But that instead it reads the negative effects of its workings as accidental or even exceptional.
And there's Delgado. That's where I was hoping we could go.
Yeah, I find his work tremendously compelling. So under this ideology of ciudadanismo, Ecuadorian visibility in the gatherings of La Chopera, rather than evident outcome of Madrid's immersion in the global arena, which of course is inseparable from the structural conditions tied to migration, what happens is that these gatherings emerge as an accident that demands and justifies interventions on and through space to assure its recuperation as public. The concern with migrant presence in public spaces works from the assumption that Ecuadorians in parks are an accidental and aleatory presence rather than inseparable from Madrid's affirmation as global city.
Right. This is the central Lefebvrean question. Who has the right to the city?
Precisely. And, the end of Ecuadorian gatherings in La Chopera just marked the beginning of new smaller reunions in other parks throughout the city, including, actually, the previously mentioned Casa de Campo. On the other hand, though, the removal continues today. In 2006, the municipality hired Latin American personnel as part of this campaign to raise immigrants' awareness of what adequate use of parks meant. And again, here we have the idea of intervening immigrant spaces to assure the survival of public spaces. Later, in January of 2009, the local government hired a team to intervene exclusively in Madrid's public parks, and this, for many, was evidence of the municipality's continued surveillance over migrants' public presence. I think the analysis of the recent history of El Retiro Southwest Corner offers a path to uncover its Ecuadorian footprints. And although they were short-lived, ignored, condemned between 2000 and 2003, this space held a possibility to understand the reality of Madrid, a possibility that was erased in order to instead offer an image of a paradise that never existed.
Linked to capital, to the sale of an image, the image of a city to which not all have an equal right of access. What is the takeaway here?
Well, the takeaway is that Ecuadorians are citizens of Madrid simply because they live there, and most have done so for over a decade now. The insistence in framing migrant presence as disruption, exception, etc., only assures the erasure of many of the histories that in fact make the city day after day.
Thanks for being here, Araceli.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Ben.
Araceli Masterson-Algar's article, Juggling Aesthetics and Surveillance in Paradise, Ecuadorians in Madrid's Retiro Park, is published in the International Journal of Iberian Studies. It's a double issue, volume 26, issue 1 and 2, from 2013, as part of a special issue on Madrid and urban cultural studies. Remember that you can access the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies in both print and online formats through Intellect Publishers. And make sure to follow our multi-authored blog for more urban discussions at urbanculturalstudies.wordpress.com.